Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening at the Oxford Martin School. My name is Cameron Hepburn. I'm the Babcock Professor of Environmental Economics at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. And it's a huge pleasure for me tonight to welcome Professor Ed Barbier. You're here because you probably know about Ed's long and distinguished contributions, starting, for me at least, in 1989 with the famous Blueprint, co-authored among one other author with David Pearce, who was influential in my early career. But Ed is the distinguished professor, university distinguished professor in econ at Colorado State, and a senior scholar as well in the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. And we're delighted to have had him here and to continue to have him here as a visiting fellow for a number of months. He's been very active and has just joined us in a meeting thinking about the state of the world and the state of the environment and how we design our research agenda to have the most impact. So Ed, and Joe as well, your contributions are really welcome. Thank you. Let me say just a little bit about Ed before he comes and informs us about sustainability, prosperity, and global decision-making in the age of ecological scarcity. I've asked him to unpack what global decision-making really means in the world that we're in at the moment, if anything. But he's very well positioned to do that because he has been consulting to both national and international and non-governmental agencies for many years, including the UN and the World Bank and the OECD. And he's a distinguished academic as well, obviously, with over 350 peer-reviewed publications in the space. And not just the papers, the books as well. There are 27 of those. So Ed, we're just delighted to have you with us tonight. I'm really looking forward to an informative and probably challenging lecture and a really rich Q&A. So, you guys in the audience and all of you online, welcome online. Get your questions ready because you'll have a chance to ask Ed in about 45 minutes. So Ed, welcome to the stage.
Thanks, Cameron, for that excellent introduction. And also, thanks, Cameron, for recommending me to be Oxford Martin School Visiting Fellow. And I appreciate greatly the opportunity to be here and to interact with all the colleagues I've met here and those I know, like Cameron, as well. So as Cameron indicated, this is quite a topic: sustainability, prosperity, and global decision-making in the age of ecological scarcity. The only thing I didn't add to the title was peace in the Middle East, but that's another issue. So what's my take on all of this? I mean, it's no surprise to any of you that we've entered a new era of increasing ecological scarcity and rising environmental risks. Global warming, land use change, and biodiversity loss, freshwater scarcity, deteriorating oceans and coasts. These are things that are plaguing us right now and are causing huge environmental and economic damages. The point I want to make is moving forward from now, how economies choose to respond to the scarcity challenge is critical to both their sustainability but also their prosperity. And in particular, I want to focus on what I think are two competing responses to this problem today. On the one hand, our economies are double down on perpetuating the fossil fuel era through erecting all sorts of barriers to greening economies, and I'll talk about these in a minute. At the same time, I do believe there are signs of emerging green innovations, markets, and investment opportunities that could bring in a green transition. And I would actually argue, and this may be a little bit controversial, but I think I'll present some evidence of this, that the lessons from history and past energy transitions suggest that this green race of emerging green innovation markets and investment opportunities is going to eventually prevail. But there are two key questions. What will it mean for global cooperation or decision-making? And will the result be greater prosperity and sustainability? So the inspiration for what I want to talk about is indeed looking back in history. And in 2011, I wrote a book called Scarcity and Frontiers: How Economies Have Developed Through Natural Resource Exploitation. And the key question I wanted to ask in this book is, how has the exploitation of key natural resources shaped economic development throughout human history? And the answer is contained in the title. I believe it has to do with scarcity and frontiers. And throughout much of history, in critical eras, a key driving force has been the response of society to the scarcity of certain natural resources. And we all know that increasing scarcity raises the cost of exploiting existing natural resources and create incentives to innovate and conserve these resources and to find substitutes, that is, new and cheaper alternatives. But actually, economies have also responded to increasing scarcity in a completely different way, which is just to find more relatively abundant and cheaper supplies of the same resource that they've been dependent on. How these two responses play out often determines which are the leading economies that are the models for patterns of global development and the long-term trends in productivity, wealth creation, prosperity, and inequality. And I think these two responses are critical for understanding what's going on in world economy today. So the key mechanism here is relative scarcity and frontiers. That is, what matters to economic development is the relative scarcity, or alternatively, the relative abundance of land and natural resources. And particularly, the relative abundance is the area or frontier of unusually abundant natural resources and land relative to labor and capital. And throughout history, there have been two types of frontiers. There have been horizontal frontiers, which is land, surface water, and ocean resources. And now, in modern era, more reliance on vertical frontiers, mineral resources, fossil fuels, and groundwater. And what we have seen throughout history, there's certain areas where exploiting or converting new sources of relatively abundant resources for production purposes, which we can call frontier expansion, has led to new combinations of the means of production. And this is a direct quote from one of my favorite economists, Joseph Schumpeter, who not only wrote the first book on economic development, called, surprisingly, Economic Development, but he actually pointed out that the conquest of a new source of supply raw materials, irrespective of whether this source already exists or whether it has first to be created, is a big push for development. So in this book, Scarcity and Frontiers, I identify, going way back to the agricultural transition over 10, 20,000 years ago, 8 key historical eras where you see this relative abundance of natural resources in response to scarcity materialize and lead to big economic development. And then in the last chapter of the book, I argue that since the late 20th century, we've actually entered a final 9th era, which I call the age of ecological scarcity, which is the Anthropocene that we have today. Now, throughout these eras, particularly the last several eras, there's been a fundamental development, which we all know about, that's dictated what's been going on, and that's the Industrial Revolution and also the fossil fuel era. These two phases, the two phases of the Industrial Revolution since 1750, have been key to the rise of the fossil fuel era, and vice versa. The two have grown symbiotically. The first phase of the Industrial Revolution from 1750 to 1830 centered on key inventions such as the steam engine, cotton spinning, railroads, and steamships. And that led to lasting productivity boosts in the world economy until the 1900s. And the leading economy model for the rest of the world was, of course, the United Kingdom. The second phase of the Industrial Revolution from 1870 to 1900 centered on key inventions such as electricity, the internal combustion engine, water and sanitation systems, refrigerated transport, and oil and gas refining, including petrochemicals. This phase, these key inventions in this phase led to productivity boosts in the world economy that lasted well into the 1970s. And of course, the United States was the leading economic model, which other countries emulated with their economies. In the contemporary era, which is the post-war period, The global development based on carbon-intensive fossil fuels that these two phases launches has, of course, led to significant alteration in the world's biosphere. And that has, of course, resulted in this final era that we're in. Hopefully it's not the last, but it's the latest, which is the age of ecological scarcity. I think what I just described, it makes possibly a little more sense if we look at it visually. So the first phase, as I said, was the leading economy was Great Britain, and that was the rise of coal. That started the shift away from biomass and other forms of energy and water towards fossil fuels. But it was really in the second phase, when we had the rise of oil and then natural gas, that we saw the full starting of the fossil fuel, the transition into the fossil fuel era. So since the 1890s, since the late 19th century, coal, oil, and gas have accounted for at least 50% of global energy use. And of course, that trend continued throughout the 20th century. And as I've also said, by the late 20th century, we entered what geologists call the Anthropocene, an era where human activity is no longer second to nature, but it's become the dominant influence on the global environment. And what I mean by that is our world economic system, our human system, has become chiefly responsible for exploiting the Earth system for inputs of energy and materials, as well as using the Earth system for massive sinks for its waste. But the consequences of that is that since the 1970s, we've seen 75% of the terrestrial environment and 66% of the marine environment has been profoundly altered. 14 out of 18 global ecosystem services have declined, and the average size of wildlife populations have fallen by 73%. That's the ecological scarcity. And of course, even though we have seen this continue on into the late 20th century, these human impacts have actually accelerated. And we've seen since the 1970s a great acceleration in human impacts, no matter which indicator you use, human populations, agricultural land, energy, carbon dioxide, and so forth. Our human impacts are accelerating, not diminishing. And we're now at the point where these human impacts on a global scale are leading to these human risks, these huge risks that I talked about earlier, these environmental risks. So in my latest book, Economics for a Fragile Planet, I asked a simple question. We've known about this age of ecological scarcity for some time. We know the global environmental risks are rising. So why do our economies continue to ignore the rising environmental and economic costs of this latest phase of ecological scarcity? Well, the answer that I write about in this book and explain and how we can deal with it is our economies continue to disregard all these costs of ecological scarcity because of underpricing and underinvesting in nature in all our market policy and business decisions. I'm not alone in saying this. In his 2021 Economics of Biodiversity, Sir Partha Dasgupta also points to this. And this is one of my favorite quotes from his book, is that essentially our biosphere is precious but priced cheaply, if it is priced at all. Worse, owing to a wide range of government subsidies, some services come with a negative price. That is, we actually pay a lot of economic activities, subsidies that harm the environment. So we're actually putting a negative price on it. Now, many economists have pointed that the underpricing of fossil fuels, just one aspect of this problem, has become a barrier to green transition. And of course, that includes Dieter Helm, a very well-known Oxford economist and colleague and friend. He pointed this out 10 years ago, is that if you want to look for a fundamental reason is why we are delaying a transition to clean energy, it's cheap fossil fuels. And they have, this has basically stopped any technical progress and economic progress towards low carbon transition. And of course, more recently, economists at the International Monetary Fund, led by Ian Perry, have actually tried to quantify how much have we been underpricing fossil fuels. In one of their studies, they showed that in 2020, underpricing of fossil fuels amounted to around $6 trillion per year. Just under $500 billion is in explicit subsidies, those environmentally harmful subsidies. But there are also all these damages that occur that effectively can also be considered underpricing. It's the cost of local air pollution that we ignore, of course, global warming, vehicle congestion, and tax revenues, losses because of underpricing. And of course, what's really interesting here is that global warming, which gets most of the attention, is not the largest one of these costs. It's actually the cost of local air pollution. And they go on in the study to show that if we change to more efficient fossil fuel pricing, get rid of the underpricing, in other words, we would lower global carbon emissions by over a third. We would prevent almost 1 million air pollution deaths each year and actually increase government revenue by around 4% of GDP. But one of the most puzzling things to economists is this idea that we continue on not just with ignoring the costs, but we also underprice, we pay a negative price through environmentally harmful subsidies. We actually pay economic activities to destroy the environment. One study put the global amount of these subsidies each year about 1.8 trillion. And to put that into context, that's roughly the GDP of Canada, which is the 13th largest economy. Now, underpricing of nature is related to the other problem, which is underinvestment in nature. Basically, if you don't treat something as a valuable asset, you're not going to maintain and enhance it. And that's essentially what we've done with nature. We underinvest in the protection, restoration, and conservation of nature because we don't value it. And in some cases, we actually put a negative price on it. And there have been some studies to show this. The Paulson Institute looked at the global financing gap for biodiversity. They found that all funding for biodiversity from public and private sources amounts to about $120 to $145 billion per year. But the investment needs to protect, restore, and conserve nature is around $700 billion to $1 trillion per year. So that means a funding gap each year of underinvestment of between $600 and $800 billion. The situation is even worse in the private sector. The World Economic Forum, in a study that Cameron and I participated as advisors, they estimated that $44 trillion of global value added, over half of the world's GDP, across 163 industry sectors and their supply chains, is either moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. Yet, evidence suggests that corporate sustainable supply chains globally allocate only $5 to $8 billion annually towards biodiversity conservation. So there's gross underinvestment in nature as well as underpricing. So that's the bad news. These are the key fundamental barriers that are preventing a transition to a greener economy. Having said that, there's another thing going on, which is a little more difficult to see, but it's in some sectors it's more prevalent than others. There is an emerging green transition. So despite this pervasive underpricing and underinvestment, we are seeing more and more businesses and economies exploiting their competitive and technological advantage in becoming greener. And there's two principal reasons for this, which I'll go over in a second. One is the slowdown in productivity growth and increasing costs of the bigger fossil fuel-based economy, the main economy, but also the investment opportunities in these new and emerging green sectors and markets are yielding higher returns than in the rest of the economy. And just recently, the UK CBI examined the net zero economy of Britain and showed indeed that productivity, employment, and returns in the net zero economy is much higher than in the rest of the British economy. And that is even magnified when you add in their supply chain effects as well. Now, what I'm arguing here, and which I'll provide more evidence of, is that what we're seeing here is the beginnings of an emerging green race for leading global sectors and markets in these areas. And this race is composed of two things. First, there's green innovation and structural change that's going to affect not just a few sectors, but eventually the product mix and production processes of the whole economy. This is starting to happen, but very slowly and very discreetly. We're also seeing the creation of environmental markets, investing in nature-based assets, and mitigating environmental risks. Again, slowly, but signs of evidence that this is occurring. Now, one of the reasons why we're seeing movement towards investments in the net zero economy is, as I mentioned, the slowdown in long-run productivity growth. Remember what I said, in the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, the productivity boost that brought on lasted to the 1970s. Well, since the 1980s, we've no longer had that boost in the world economy. And indeed, not only has global productivity growth been largely stagnant, it started to fall first in advanced economies, and then more recently, since the Great Recession, it's fallen in emerging market developing economies. So the diagram on the left is from the World Bank, which shows the trends in these various economies. The diagram on the right, which is from Ian Golden and other economists, including some at Oxford, show the decline in major advanced economies. So the slowdown in long-run productivity group has been a feature we've been living with. There's a lot of reasons that are put forward for the slowdown. The first is, of course, weakness of investment. The working age population growth in economies has decelerated. Educational attainment has stabilized, and there's been an innovation slowdown in the main traditional sectors. But there's also a possibility that we're starting to see diminishing returns and rising costs of the fossil fuel-based economy. Even though many of these costs are hidden, they are not obvious in our economy, but they're still hitting us with some of those damages and huge subsidies that I talked about before. Again, this is something I hinted at when I talked about the emerging age of ecological scarcity. The costs associated with current resource use in the fossil fuel-based economy and sector is rising faster than the increase or output or even economy-wide benefits. Interestingly enough, in the World Bank study of productivity, long-run productivity, they latch onto one possible reason for this. I don't think it's the only one, but I think it's an important one, which is shocks to our economy that come from natural disaster, wars, and major economic disruptions has really contributed to the long-run productivity slowdown. And what's interesting is they reckon that 70% of these shocks are climate-related. Of course, this was published in 2021. We've known there's been more climate-related shocks since then, and other environmental shocks. Now I want to talk to the main part of this. I've thrown out this idea of this competitive race for green economies, which is starting to emerge, that we're starting to see. I want to give you some evidence of this and talk a little bit about that before I start talking about what it means for global cooperation, sustainability, and prosperity. An Oxford economist, when he was at Grantham Institute, Sam Fankhauser, led a study which investigated the green competitiveness of 110 manufacturing sectors across 8 major economies to start to determine which economies are likely to green their sectors first. He was the first one to, and his colleagues, to call attention to this green race that was starting to emerge. 2 other Oxford economists, Penny Mealy and Alex Teitelbaum, also investigated this effect, and they showed that countries are able to export, green products competitively are more likely to have other positive environmental and economic attributes. When you look at what's going on in the world today, one of the things that has been tracked is what's the degree of green market capitalization that's going on in the major markets of the world. And across the world economy, around 9% of market capitalization could be called green. So it's not insignificant, not huge, not significant. On the left-hand side, it looks like the United States is the dominant share. It's over 60% of green market capitalization is occurring in the United States, and then the rest of the economies are further behind than that. But when you actually look at the importance of green market capitalization relative to overall capitalization, you see something else going on. Although the United States dominates the whole green world economy at the moment in terms of market capital, it's not the dominant one within its own economy. Green market capitalization is less than 9%. It's only about 8% in the United States, whereas other countries, it's much higher, including in China, Germany, and Taiwan in particular. It's a whopping 30%. So this is a sign that some economies are actually putting a lot into green economy sectors. One indicator that Penny Mealy and Pia Andrus did, it started here at Oxford, but it's now moved to LSE, is the Green Transition Navigator, which looks at how competitive countries are in green products and production processes. And what's very interesting is that the figure on the left shows the degree of competitiveness of countries today, currently, and you can see that Germany is well ahead, and then there's Italy, China, United States, Japan, and so forth. But what's interesting is that their potential for green competitiveness, which is the figure on the right, changes. China suddenly comes out as very strong, Italy as well. South Korea makes an important interest, and even India. So it's not obvious that it's going to be the major market economies that are going to be leading this green race in terms of products and production process. It's a very fluid and competitive situation right now. This also comes across with green innovation, environmentally related patents and innovations. Now, again, look at the figure on the left. When you go back to the 1990s, 3 economies dominated green innovation: Japan, United States, and Germany. But as we move to the present age, suddenly China leaps to the forefront. Germany declines, US declines, Japan declines. They're still leaders. South Korea is boosted up, and other major European economies are relatively small shares. So already we've seen in less than 20, 30 years a huge change in the pattern of green innovation across economies. The figure on the right is even more interesting. This is, again, the relative technological advantage of economies relative to the world average. So 1 is the world average, that's the benchmark. But the economies to the left of the orange 1 for the world, those are economies that have a relative technical advantage in green innovation ahead of the world. And you can see some interesting smaller countries here too, and some that are not necessarily advanced economies, emerging economies like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Brazil, and of course China as well. So again, green innovation tells us it's a very competitive situation, and we are seeing a bunch of players and actors. It's not clear who is leading the green race in terms of innovation and products and processes. What I think is happening here as well is going along with the whole trend in the world economy right now. We are seeing in the green space a major shift going on in global public policy. And I want to talk a little bit about this later. Essentially, the shift is away from global cooperation. I think we're going to see less cooperation in coming years, and we're already seeing that, over combating climate change and other global environmental risks. We're going to see less cooperation over lowering trade barriers to green products and technology transfers. And we're going to see less emphasis on using economic instruments such as carbon pricing to reduce environmental bads. Instead, we're going to see public policy shift towards a more competitive complement to the green race, which is to win the green transition. We're going to see increasingly countries use green industrial policies that target financial support and subsidies for key domestic green sectors and industries, including protecting them. And that protection is going to rise And we're going to see more and more protective policies to shield domestic green sectors from international competition. And we're going to see more use of domestic environmental regulations to restrict imports and promote exports, rather than the use of more transparent and easily to see taxes and so forth, and pricing. We're also going to see, as part of this shift towards winning the green transition, some economies are going to go after boosting their green innovation. As I showed you, some have a technological advantage now, some are likely to have one very quickly, and we're going to see a push towards this. And one reason for it is the space is wide open, because in the major economies, we're seeing many governments actually reduce their green tech research and development just when it's needed most. And we're seeing that particularly in major G7 economies. Despite the rhetoric, despite the increase, we're actually seeing less in relative terms than ever before. So there's an opportunity here for many economies to fill this space. What does this all mean? What I think we're going to start seeing is the rise of green mercantilism, a nationalist, self-interested approach towards my green industries, my products, my innovation versus the rest of the world, and less cooperation. Okay, now this is one very important part of the green transition story, but there's another part that's also important, which is getting less attention, yet it's happening, which is the growth in environmental markets. One I've talked about already, which is pricing environmental bads. This is important, but I actually think it's starting to either not increase as much as it used to, or pretty much stabilize. But what we're also starting to see is another growth, which is growth in environmental markets to value the goods produced by environmental capital. That includes payment for ecosystem services, funding nature-based solutions, credits for carbon and biodiversity offsets, creating nature reserves, conserving in-stream flows and sources, and so forth. And then we're also going to see increasing inclusion of environmental risks in financial and business decisions. And this is important because these environmental risks are considered to be essential to investors and current future market decisions. Let's talk about environmental markets first. I'm not going to talk about the first one, but I want to talk about the growth of environmental markets. The one you've probably heard the most about is carbon markets, because there's been a huge jump here. And in the carbon market, there's actually two types of credits. One are regulatory compliance credits, or carbon allowances, and then there's the voluntary carbon offset credits, where firms voluntarily trade to offset their carbon emissions. These are two separate markets. The one that's really expanded in recent years has been the voluntary credits, and a huge component of this market is actually nature-based solutions, which are actions to conserve, sustainably manage, and restore natural modified ecosystems, thus delivering a whole bunch of co-benefits, biodiversity ecosystem benefits, as well as reducing or removing carbon emissions. Over 1/3 of voluntary credits issued in the voluntary carbon market are from nature-based solutions. And in 2021, the market peaked at 1.3 billion nature-based solution credits transacted, which was 2/3 of the value of all voluntary credits. At that time, people were saying, well, this market is exploding, and we could see by 2050 nearly 10 billion tons of carbon equivalent emissions per year removed, which is more than the total emissions produced by the global transport sector. Now current trends suggest that that may have been a little bit over-optimistic. The current market growth in the last few years, since 2021, has slowed, has even fallen, with concerns over verification and things like additionality, leakage, and permanence of the credits of nature-based solutions. This is what the market looks most recently. You can see the huge growth from 2010. It went from nowhere to suddenly 2021, this huge market. And since 2010, over 800 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions have been issued and retired, and over 400 have been retired. But you can also see that there's been a drop off since 2022, 23, 24. Now, many people say, okay, well, then maybe the emphasis on environmental market growth, as witnessed by the carbon market, it's overemphasized. But what we're seeing is other environmental markets also expand. The full scope of these markets includes markets for other environmental benefits, such as biodiversity credits and water, sustainably produced commodities that depend directly on nature, including agriculture, seafood, timber, and wildlife-based products, trading in rights to specific natural resources, such as freshwater trading rights and land rights, and then nature-based derivative markets and other financial products, loosely called nature-based assets. These are all growth areas that are happening today, even though the carbon market has stalled a little bit. In addition, companies are expanding their nature-related targets and investments beyond carbon to include all sorts of environmental impacts. And at least one study suggests that if you put together this whole global bioeconomy of environmental markets, it may be worth as much as $4 to $5 trillion and could grow to $30 trillion by 2050. McKinsey recently released a report to show exactly what's going on here in companies that you can see on the left. Carbon markets either acknowledge or targets have stagnated or just fallen slightly, but not in the other areas of water, chemicals, and plastics, biodiversity, forests, and nitrogen and other pollutants. So there is movement and demand. I mentioned this new asset class. This is a very new thing. It has a huge potential promise, and it's expanding. These are essentially derivatives and other financial products directly related to ecosystem assets or services. And this is where new AI technology, environmental monitoring, and information technology are all converging to make it feasible to do this. And essentially what's happening is that ecosystems are basically, and their services are basically tokenized, and through blockchains, they're split up, and then you can buy and trade in these parts of the assets, and the money goes back to the ecosystems and the local communities that are there. This is not just a theory. There's actually a project, a big project covering over 71 million hectares in eastern Indonesia called the Maluku Token Project that is doing exactly this. There's also an expansion in private funds, both nonprofit and venture capital, investing in conservation, indigenous communities, and climate initiatives. Most famous is probably Patagonia's Home Planet Fund, but there are other smaller funds that are quite interesting, which is Native Rising, which is funds, private funds, venture capitalists to support indigenous communities. The Velveteen Ventures also supports indigenous communities, but aimed at children as well as climate investments together, seeing that they're both part of the future. You also see specific actors investing in nature-based assets for sustainable production. One of the most well-known ones is the Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship, or CBOS. And essentially, this is an industry science partnership where 8 companies representing 10% of the global seafood output is working with scientists to try and figure out how can we manage and sustain the ocean stocks on which their businesses depend. The other area that I think is showing incredible growth and potential for growth is in environmental and business risks. Basically, we're seeing climate and environmental risks increasingly linked to business risks and uncertainty in general through a whole range of connections, from supply chains to investments, credit and financial risk, and even regulatory and policy risk as well. A study recently by PwC shows that when you look at the market value of companies listed in 19 major stock exchanges, you'll see that most of them are highly exposed in terms of financial risks through their dependence or on nature. And what this means is that there's now this huge incentive to invest in environmental risk management because it's attractive to potential investors, financial institutions, shareholders, and consumers. And then these investors and institutions are increasingly requiring assurances that their customers, the firms, manage their environmental risks, mitigate some of the most pressing ones, and incorporate these assessments in their business strategies and investment decisions. Mandatory environmental risk management measures are on the rise as well in many markets. And what we're seeing essentially is this emerging global market where environmental risk management services and strategies are a booming industry within one of the big services, which is consultancy, scientific and technical advice. Okay, so let me just summarize where we're at right here, and then I want to move on to what does this mean. So we're at this critical point here in the world economy where we're seeing these two competing forces at work. On one hand, what I talked about with the underpricing and undervaluing of nature, we're essentially perpetuating the fossil fuel era through these barriers because they are barriers to greening our economies, all the aspects that I talked about. On the other hand, despite these barriers, we are seeing evidence of emerging green innovation markets and investment opportunities, not just to low carbon energy and so forth, but also through the growth of environmental markets and, of course, new industries like environmental risk management and so forth. I think that despite the barriers that are there in our economy, despite this perpetuation, we're doing everything possible to perpetuate the fossil fuel eras, there's increasing evidence that the green race for global sectors and markets will eventually prevail. It's going to produce winners and losers, just as I talked about in scarcity and frontiers. The ultimate outcome is that there's going to be industries, and there's going to be corporate players, there's going to be whole economies that are going to be winners and losers. Those economies that lag behind are going to face loss of investment opportunities, less innovation, and lower long-run productivity growth. Those leading the race are going to benefit from boosts to innovation, long-run productivity, and prosperity. So the answer to my first question is, I think the green race will eventually prevail, and it will eventually lead to some kind of boost to long-run productivity and prosperity. Who will win the green race? I think it's too early to tell. Like I said, it's just merging. As the figures I showed you about production processes, innovation, and potential, it's unclear who's going to emerge. Maybe it'll be even a country that's not even on that list. One of the things we want to ask ourselves is, okay, this is starting to happen. This green race is likely to lead to this new era of prosperity. What's its implications for low carbon transition? Well, here I'm less optimistic. Even if this green race bears fruition in terms of more green innovation markets and investments, and it leads to more clean energy use, the rate at which this happens is going to be too long to usher in a low carbon energy transition. By too long, I mean it's going to take longer than what we think. And we know that energy transitions, when they do occur, we know from lessons from history, that they do take a long time. And I don't think there's any evidence to suggest otherwise for this one. It's going to take a while, partly because of those barriers I talked about, and partly because this is what energy transitions don't happen overnight. And I think that, if we use our benchmark, what's the composition of our energy use? And if we use our benchmark that we could clearly say we're in a low carbon energy transition when we surpass 50% of our energy use from these low carbon sources. Right now, the evidence suggests that transition is complicated by the fact that total primary energy use continues to grow. And energy from low carbon sources, renewables, hydro, and nuclear, although they're increasing, it's not increasing quickly enough from these sources to keep pace with the growing energy demand. So that means that fossil fuel use continues to grow alongside the growth in low carbon energy. There's some substitution between the two going on, but right now the two are growing together because overall energy use is growing. And the recent BP Energy Outlook from last year illustrates what I'm talking about. Let's look at the left-hand side first. So they have two scenarios there. They have the current trajectory and where it's likely to lead to 2050, and then they have the optimistic net zero. How would energy change to achieve net zero? And you can see that on the left-hand graph that under current trajectory, total energy use is growing, and it's going to continue to grow and won't start to level out until 2050. However, for net zero to occur, we have to have a drastic drop between now and 2050 in total primary energy use. Now, what does that mean in terms of switching from fossil fuels to low carbon sources? Well, today in 2022, approximately 16% of the world's primary energy use is from clean energy sources, renewables, nuclear, and hydro. Under the current trajectory of continuing growth in primary energy, at best by 2050, we will have 33%. So by 2050, the low carbon transition is occurring, but by 2050, we're not going to get that 50% or more target. The net zero target suggests that, yeah, we could have achieve a drop in primary energy use and we do the substitution, we could achieve 68% by net zero. But that means even under this most optimistic scenario, which seems unlikely under current policy and economic conditions, it could take into the early 2040s before we have transition to more 50% or more of our energy from low carbon use. So what's the implication for sustainability? As I said, the green transition isn't just about low carbon energy transition, it's about all the growth in structural change and innovations, as well as these new markets for the environment and investment opportunities and reducing environmental risks. Well, again, I'm not entirely optimistic, is that even if emerging green innovation markets and investments across all these sectors of our economy coalesce into a true green transition, it may take too long to avert global environmental risks. One reason is because these barriers of pricing and underinvestment are formidable, and they're supported by powerful economic interests that oppose such a transition and will do everything to slow it down. The other is that governments and public policies will have a crucial role in influencing the effectiveness, and speed of green transition. But that depends critically on global cooperation, coordination of green policies. If we want to tackle the major common global environmental risks, these cannot be solved, these risks, by the green race alone. Coordination of global policy is required, and decision-making for climate change, biodiversity loss, and all these other environmental risks. I think we're going to have the green race, but I think it's going to come through a new age of green mercantilism. Economies competing over lucrative new market and business opportunities, which will be good for those that win for their economies, and it'll be good in terms of some of the transition, but it won't be necessarily positive for cooperation. So, unfortunately, the rise of green market sectors and economic opportunities may be inevitable, and it is starting to happen, but the result may not necessarily be sustainable. And it may also depend an awful lot on who wins the green race and how they do it. One of the problems here is what I've been talking about is the difference between global cooperation versus competition. How we bring in the transition. It depends critically on these two things. And they're very different. Global cooperation is necessary for sustainability if we believe sustainability is about reducing ecological scarcity and environmental risks. And it's a self-reinforcing process. But it's a very different process in terms of what I'm observing right now, which is a green race, which is really a competition for prosperity race, where again, it's a self-reinforcing market. And we can easily have this, the competition for prosperity, which we're seeing, and forego that. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, and we're seeing this decline. So why do I believe that? Well, we could very well, in the last 30 years, have lived in a very unusual age of global cooperation over a whole bunch of green issues. Global cooperation and policy coordination. And it started with the Kyoto Protocol. It included the attempt by the G20 to get together and decide we should spend, as part of our stimulus in response to the Great Recession, at least $520 billion was spent on green stimulus. There was talk even about a global Green New Deal as part of the recovery. It never materialized, but we did get the Paris Climate Accord. The Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, she revived the idea of the Green New Deal. And of course, we had the EU Green New Deal come in 2019. And then during the COVID era recovery, once again, major economies came together and they decided to spend over almost $900 billion on green recovery. And then at the end of this period, we had the US Inflation Recovery Act, which was both another example of major green spending, but it was also a signal of a major economy going down the green mercantilist route, pushing its own national agenda of protecting and encouraging its green industries at the expense of the rest of the world. Now, this era, if you look at these things, it looks highly cooperative, and it has been. Was it successful? Not entirely. As if you just look at greenhouse gas emissions, during this whole period, they continued to rise. Probably these impacts of this cooperation brought them down. But the thing that really concerns me is that during this era as well, we have seen something else happen in our world, which is the rather rapid decline of democracy. So since 2005, democracy has declined for 18 consecutive years. Today, 91 countries are considered democratic and 88 are considered autocratic or authoritarian. But when you look at the world population, it's even more stark. Right now, 5.7 billion people, or 71% of the world population, live in essentially autocratic regimes. And that number has increased 48% just in the last 10 years. So this decline is very rapid. What does it mean? Well, what I think it means for us is that we may, as I say, have witnessed an end of an era of global cooperation, because democracy, I think, is important bedrock on which global cooperation has based. And it's been the leading democracies of the world have generally been behind much of those events that occurred that I pointed out in the last 30 years. So there's two possible outcomes looking 30 years ahead. We continue to see rapid decline in democracy, both within existing democracies and around the world. We're going to see moving away from that self-reinforcing cooperation for sustainability and more towards that self-reinforcing competition for prosperity and the green race. But that's going to lead to rising ecological risks and scarcity. We're going to end up with less sustainable economies and societies. On the other hand, if somehow we see a reversal of fortunes and democracy starts to revive and we see increasing cooperation for sustainability, there will be the green race, but it will be less of a focus. It won't be just that. Then we could have a chance to tackle some of our major ecological risks and scarcity, provided that they don't careen out of control. So my final remarks are this, and then I'm really interested in your questions, is I do think we're at this critical point where we see two competing responses to this age of ecological scarcity. Perpetuating the fossil fuel era through these massive barriers to greening economies, but at the same time, we're seeing emerging green innovation markets and investment opportunities. even if the green race prevails and it does lead to greater prosperity, I'm not so optimistic. It could be too little and too late to ensure sustainability. That's going to depend on a couple things: who wins or loses this green race, and whether democracy and global cooperation continue to decline or whether they start to revive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ed. That was a tour de force, very wide canvas on which you're painting, and I'm sure others will get their paintbrushes out and want to add to it as well. I've already got a hand. Keep the hands. I'm just going to steal a march on you, sorry, because we do have 20 minutes. Just on this very last point, there's a sort of an assumption there, more than an assumption, it was argued for, that democracy is essential in some sense to achieving sustainability. I'm just wondering what you would say to someone who says, well, look at the progress being made in an autocracy such as China on the green agenda. Do we need to link these two things, or can we make progress in different ways in different political regimes?
I think individually countries can make progress. I think China has a great incentive to engage in the green race, and they're doing that. They're one of the leading economies, and they've got a very good chance of being one of the winners that come out. What I'm not so sure is that once they become the winners, or they start to win, and they start to become dominant in the economic world today or in the near future, will they be also welcoming to more global cooperation and fostering democracy elsewhere in the world? Yeah, I don't know.
And you see that global cooperation is essential to sustainability.
Absolutely.
And so why is it that autocracies don't cooperate as well, do you think, if we take that as an assumption?
Most autocracies, I think, in the world today, and autocratic elements within democracies, I believe, have a strong connection to perpetuating the fossil fuel era, in one form or the other, or at least perpetuating the need to get more sources and sinks of materials and sources to keep themselves going. They're attached to the old model. China is different. India may be different. South Korea is not as a democracy. India is a democracy. Again, as I say, there's some things that we can't predict here. I don't know who's going to win the green race, and that could determine how we view democracy and global cooperation moving forward. Right now, looking at what's going on in the G20, I'm less optimistic that forum. It used to be a powerful forum for green cooperation. They were behind the Great Recession, that cooperation within the G20. Right now, the G20 is fractured, and with what's going on in the world today, one could argue the G7 is all at sea. So I'm not able to answer that question fully, but.
Right, well, let's answer 2 of my 17. So let's start here at the front with the lady right there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The end, I was fascinated by the end as well, and I'd like to follow on with that, saying, what about what Gary Stevenson is saying about wealth inequality? Because our economic algorithms don't factor in, and what we're seeing happening in America looks very much like an oligarchy. We've got something very similar in the UK as well, I believe.
Excellent question. No, I mean, this talk was already long enough, so I didn't bring in the wealth and inequality. Let's start with Thomas Piketty. Thomas Piketty, the French economist who wrote recently Capital in the 21st Century. And one of the things he observed about inequality in the world is that when the rate of return on capital exceeds the rate of productivity, that's where you start to see areas of very vast inequality of wealth and income. And essentially, as I showed you, long-run productivity has gone down, but the rate of return on capital has not. So it's not surprising we're in an era of huge inequality if Piketty is correct. What will the green race do? Well, the green race in the short run, I think, will accentuate inequality, or at least not make it better or make it more equal, because initially what's going to drive it is the return on capital, chasing new sources of capital investment opportunities. But that should lead to greater economy-wide innovation if it leads to structural change and greater productivity. And it's possible that in the medium to long term, inequality will get a little better. But again, it depends on who wins and who loses and what political systems do in response to the green race and our policies too.
There's a lot in that discussion too that we could spend another 10 minutes on, but let's go to the lady there in the green.
Thank you. Just looking at the targets for net zero and the percentage of renewables globally that we need to achieve in order to get to net zero, it strikes me that we've never really considered the fact that wealthier nations and consumers don't want to pay emerging economies not to extract their fossil fuels. And that is an assumption in that net zero calculation. So if we're not going to pay them to not extract, how are we ever going to get there?
I don't think we do. I mean, that net zero scenario, I actually think that's BP Energy Outlook's most optimistic scenario. This is what we need to do to get to net zero by 2050. I actually think that our current policies, the move away from global cooperation and coordination and jointly adapting, mitigating, is actually going to make it harder to reach net zero, including technology transfer and assisting emerging economies to reduce their fossil fuel. So, for example, one of the things the G7 brought in during the last 4 or 5 years was the Just Energy Transition Partnership. This was actually what you're talking about, where some of the G7 countries, including the G7 itself, led by the United States, but also the UK and Germany, were putting money into certain emerging, particularly democratic countries to help them transition from use of coal in particular to renewables, but also transition fuels like natural gas. And that's part of the global net zero strategy. I don't see that type of program moving forward in the current climate. And in fact, I think, if I'm correct, and we're going to see more of a green race for green markets, for markets, innovations, and business opportunities, we're going to see less and less of that type of cooperative policy and more countries looking after themselves and their national interests.
Okay, the gentleman there, unless he's changed his mind. No, yes, we've got a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting talk. One of the really powerful points that Dieter Helm makes, of course, is that we must reduce consumption. You touched on this, which is a big ask.
Yep.
And he's also, he says we must do that so that we can maintain assets and not use from current income and not use borrowing. But it's a bit vague about what assets are. Certainly natural capital, infrastructure, whether education and knowledge sort of comes in and out of focus in his work. I just wondered what your view is. You've talked a lot about investment in natural capital, renewables. What about investment in human resources? How important is investment in human capital? A final quick point, we tend to talk about that in terms of green skills, but actually there's a huge public engagement agenda, because one thing that has happened in democracies is a kind of splintering of the knowledge commons. We're all in separate epistemological worlds. What role have we got as educators to rebuild that knowledge commons as part of a human capital approach?
I'm glad you raised that, because I actually wrote a book called Nature and Wealth about the two twins, rising ecological scarcity and inequality. And one of the arguments I made in the book is not just about this underinvestment and underpricing of nature, but the underinvestment in human capital and how that comes at a cost to all of our economies for exactly the reasons you talk about. And I had some proposals in that book about how to deal with it. A little different than Thomas Piketty, but it was about basically making sure that our human capital investments keep up with our other investments. Because essentially we have three, my view, the world has been always to suggest that there's three forms of capital that our economies depend on. Natural capital, physical capital, which is the things we make, machines and equipment, and including computers. And then there's our human capital, the training and education of our workforce. And then also There's also quite evidence to show, including from the Nobel Prize winning economist Claudia Golden and David Katz, is that we've underinvested in human capital. How much economies that do so, not only to have lower productivity and growth, but it also leads to all sorts of other social problems. But it means, more importantly, we can't capitalize on these other investments. They're complementary.
So we've got several questions coming in online. I'll put some of them in a bundle to you now, Ed, and then we'll come back to the room. I've already got one or two queued. So firstly, the impact of populism is one on this agenda. How does it play out? Second, how do we think about the appropriate number of factors of production when we're thinking about the green transition? And capital and labor is obviously a little bit limiting, and I know you've done plenty of work on multi-factor models. How useful will environmental markets be? And then finally, how does the digital transition and perhaps artificial intelligence help or harm us getting to sustainability? So there's a small number of little things for you to consider.
Yeah. They didn't ask about peace in the Middle East. I'm disappointed.
It's coming.
Okay.
This is question 5.
Okay, I say. Well, let's start with the last one. I think information technology is going to be, and artificial intelligence, machine learning, all this aspect, spatial technologies, imaging and so forth, are going to be a huge part of this green race. But it's going to be, if I'm correct, and this green race is going to be done mainly on national interests, involve private sector and so forth. Whoever controls or invents the technologies is going to be in charge. Now, these technologies could also be used to help us manage global environmental risks and common ecological scarcity problems, and some of that will happen. We'll have better monitoring, let's say, of natural disasters and predictions and so forth. But essentially, most of the technology is going to be used for chasing profitable opportunities in the green sector, whether it's environmental markets, nature-based assets, or even transitioning to low carbon technologies across industries. So it's got a role to play, but the sharing of this technology, that again, along with adaptation, mitigation, is something that it's not clear that the cooperation globally is going to ensure that it's shared equally. So it's going to be about who wins and who loses by using this technology. First.
The other ones were populism, factors of production, and environmental markets.
Well, factors of production, my view has always been that there are 3 essential factors of production, the 3 capitals I mentioned: natural capital, human capital, and physical capital. We have a tendency to go through our natural capital pretty quickly in our economies, and those natural capital sources that are marketed, things, conventional natural inputs like fossil fuels, minerals, timber, agricultural land, those things are pretty much covered by our market. If there's scarcity, there's a problem, our market's going to reflect, and we're going to substitute capital and labor for diminishing amounts of those resources, including technological innovations. It's the non-marketed natural capital, particularly our ecological capital, the ecosystems that are so important to our livelihoods and to our health, that don't appear in markets but are a very vital part of our economy. Those are disappearing, and that's the rising ecological scarcity. We have no market signals, and we're ignoring these things, and we're actually paying our economic activities to destroy them. So unless we do something about that, we're not going to deal with many of our growing ecological scarcity problems, and those costs will spread across our economy in things like health costs, natural disasters, loss of huge services that are important to us, clean air, water, including support for our businesses and so on, and supply chains.
Great, we'll take this last.
Populism.
Okay.
I didn't get the populism. That's an interesting one. I think part of the problem is that we as economists have failed to adequately explain how serious this part of the crisis is for our economies. I've done my best, Cameron's done his best, Dieter Helm's done his best, so have many other economists, but we haven't really taken grips and put our head around the role the environment plays in our economy. We've always treated the environment as something out there to exploit and to use, abuse, and even be the source, the sink for our waste. We can no longer afford to do that. And I think that as soon as possible, we need to keep pushing the role of environment in economics more clearly. So if there's a populist rise against doing something to include the environment in our economy, I think economists need to do a better job explaining why it's important to do so.
It's always good to understand things. Okay, so we have the lady here in the third row and then the gentleman behind in the fourth. And then I'm going to ask you about peace in the Middle East.
Thank you so much. It seems like United States is like slowly withdrawing itself from this kind of green race with like a recent developments, like, and also investing in more like priorities with like not so friendly environmentally friendly projects in AI as well and other infrastructural projects. Do you think that other Western countries would take this same kind of trends and like maybe try to prioritize different things such as more like defense and less like environmentally friendly projects, or do you think that will not be the case? And or what is the scenario in this case? Do you think that we'll be only left with the like few players in a green race such as China or India, or maybe Western countries will like kick more for the, unlike the United States, to the more friendly, environmentally friendly projects?
I think the shift from global cooperation to competition over prosperity is happening in all areas of our economy. It will certainly happen in the green sectors. And this is something that's often hard for people, I think, to appreciate. I mean, we usually think, you know, we want green sectors because it's good for the environment, stuff like that. But I don't see that. I think that cooperation to save the world is going. And what's happening in many countries that used to push for cooperation, the whole world system of the post-war agreement on international rules and regulations, trade, is being upended. And I think that's going to happen increasingly with the green sectors. There's good reasons for some economies to go for that. They could be the big winners.
And last question from the floor, yes, gentleman in green.
Your trajectories were relatively smooth, and humans make decisions mostly on psychological and emotional basis rather than rational basis. What would be the effect of increasingly large-scale and frequent natural disasters on these trajectories? We can't tell exactly when and where it will happen. We know what are the disaster-prone areas of the world with large economic activity that affects the entire global economy. So what do you think of the potential effect of increasingly large natural disasters?
I'm quite worried about it, to be honest, because they keep getting bigger, more intense, more frequent, and their impact already is being felt, as I pointed out, on long-run productivity, and it's getting worse. And they could, I mean, what do we need to have in terms of a big catastrophe before we start changing our approach? I don't know the answer to that. I keep thinking, well, this one might do it because it's happened in this country, which is a wake-up call. But hello, the alarm bell's ringing, and we're still asleep.
The alarm bell is ringing. You said jokingly about peace in the Middle East. We have 1 minute. It's a serious question, though, because when Saudi Arabia loses its oil and gas revenue, when Qatar loses its gas revenue, when, whether sanctioned or otherwise, Iran has no more fossil revenue, what happens to that part of the world? Quite apart from what's happening right now, is that a massive tinderbox of conflict? Or do they manage their sovereign wealth funds in a way to manage a transition to a prosperous, cleaner world?
That's a great question. I would like to think that they manage their sovereign wealth funds, but the truth of the matter is that in most of the countries you mentioned, the price of extracting a barrel of oil is like $5, and it's still hard for our low carbon sources to compete with that. There's also plenty of oil around at $5. And I see that as the benchmark for some time before we get to the point where there's too much oil and not enough demand. Because like I say, I don't see, I see us maybe not as bad as the current trajectory suggests, where it may take us that long for low energy, but I don't see the low energy carbon transition occurring in the next 10 years in the world. It's going to be 10, 20. So we're going to be dependent on fossil fuels for a large part of our sources for some time. It might be important, that $5, in terms of switching from coal to slightly cleaner or lower carbon fossil fuels. That may happen. What it means for peace in the Middle East, I'll leave that to the political scientists.
All right, well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. There's a lot more I'd like to say about that, but thank you all in the room for participating with those excellent questions. Thanks to you online for the questions that you sent in, and of course, thanks most of all to Ed for a very stimulating hour and a quarter.
Thank you.